to the FSC's Connect webinar. What is modern slavery? Why should we care? And what should we do? In my role of Head of Regulatory Affairs for the Financial Services Council, I became aware of MBIE's consultation on modern slavery legislation in 2022. I did not fully appreciate the impact to New Zealand nor financial markets and was surprised at a whopping 5,614 submissions. Even more alarming are the conservative estimates, 8,000 people in modern slavery in New Zealand. Today, I'm joined by a panel that share my passion to educate our industry to end this appalling practice in New Zealand. Today, we hope you will not only learn what modern slavery is, but why you should care about it, and leave today knowing what you can start doing now within your role and organisation to make a difference. Before I ask my panel to introduce themselves, we would like to learn more about who is attending this webinar. Please, can we have the first poll up? We invite you to share a little bit more about you and who you are in this poll, and we will share these insights soon. Big thank you for all the questions that we received through the registration, which we will be addressing through this webinar. And we will also invite you to ask any questions in the chat function that I will pose to the panel throughout the webinar, or if we have time at the end. So let's learn more about today's panel. I'm going to ask each of my panelists to introduce themselves, their role, and where it fits in their organisation. Let's start with you, Gemma Livingston.
Kia ora, everyone. My name is Gemma Livingston, and I lead KPMG New Zealand's business and human rights and social impact work. In the modern slavery space, we work with clients at all stages of modern slavery journeys. So risk assessments, assistance with reporting criteria, internal training, due diligence protocols and controls, pretty much anywhere where a business is at, we will help them with New Zealand and global requirements.
Thank you, Gemma. Rachel Tinkler.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ka mihi ki ngā maunga, ngā wai, ngā waka, me ngā iwi o te whenua nei, ko Rachel Tinkler tōku ingoa, ko taku tūranga mahi ki Mint Asset Management, ko te Head of Responsible Investment. So my role is to support and enhance the integration of ESG considerations into Mint's investment process, as well as increase engagement with our investee companies and policymakers. So I either lead or support investment team members on engagements, including thematic engagements, and a focus of ours this year is modern slavery.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. Sam Green.
Kia ora koutou, ko Sam Green tōku ingoa ki Westpac aho I mahi ana. I'm Sam Green and I'm a Senior Sustainability Manager at Westpac. I have a focus on our social impacts as a bank and also been leading Westpac New Zealand's response to modern slavery legislation in Australia.
Thank you, Sam. And lastly, we are joined by Sarhanna Hassim.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sarhanna Hassim. I'm currently a Senior Compliance Manager at Tower Insurance, where I lead various compliance initiatives, such as towards modern slavery compliance, and I also provide second-line compliance oversight to the business.
Wonderful. Thank you and welcome panel for today. So to kick off our webinar, Gemma, can you recall when you first became aware of or your role involved modern slavery?
Now, this might be showing my age a little bit, but I've actually been engaged on and off with modern slavery for over 20 years. So I started my career as a criminal prosecutor in New Zealand, and I was involved in some human trafficking cases and led our online child exploitation and sexual abuse prosecutions. Before joining KPMG, I worked with a commercial law firm in Australia. There I worked with clients during the consultation stage of the implementation of the Australian and New South Wales Modern Slavery Acts. I also led our human rights pro bono practice, and within that we worked with government, NGOs and corporate clients on modern slavery matters, including child exploitation, forced marriage, human trafficking, coercive control, litigation of forced labour, so all gambits of modern slavery.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gemma. So given the depth of your experience, can you tell us all what is modern slavery? Does it or can it happen in financial markets?
Absolutely. So modern slavery is what we call an umbrella term. There's no legal definition that's used universally across the globe, but the umbrella term is used to describe a range of crimes of severe exploitation. So that can be that holds a person so they cannot leave due to actions such as threats or violence, deception, financial control, coercive control. So modern slavery can include actions such as trafficking in persons, slavery, servitude, forced marriage, forced labour, debt bondage, the worst forms of child labour, and deceptive recruitment for labour services. It's a growing problem and it's getting a lot more attention. Most recent estimates are that there is around 50 million people currently living in conditions of modern slavery globally. And with that, there's an estimated 41,000 people in modern slavery in Australia and 8,000 just right here within New Zealand. The New Zealand estimate had actually risen from 3,000 to 8,000 within just 5 years. So, and I'll just say why modern slavery is so prevalent is that it is big business. So International Labour Organization has recently estimated that around US $236 billion annually is made through forced labour practices. And the financial services is considered to be a high risk of modern slavery as a sector. Now, the sector's exposure to modern slavery arises in part due to links via credit and other relationships to industries across the globe. The financial services sector tends to engage in a wide variety of complex activities and relationships, which increases the risk, as well as corporate operations and supply chains, so your regular day-to-day operations within New Zealand. Modern slavery risks arise in financial products and services with corporate relationships, so customers, members, business partners, assets, investments, all increasing potential risk. Now, the UN Guiding Principles, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights consider modern slavery as a continuum of conduct. So an entity may directly cause, they may contribute to harm, or where there may be harm directly linked in their operations, products, or services through its business relationship. So just because an entity, a financial services entity, is not directly harming, may still mean that they are caught up in modern slavery risk.
It's certainly quite alarming. And is New Zealand doing anything about it? Is there any legislation that prevents it in New Zealand?
There's laws. There are laws that mean that the crimes themselves of the types of behaviours we talked about, like trafficking and forced labour, are there in place. But at this stage, I cannot update you that we have modern slavery legislation because we don't. In 2022, there was a public consultation on proposed legislation. Last year, the Labour government announced drafting of modern slavery legislation. That legislation proposed a reporting mechanism under which businesses earning over 20 million in annual revenue would need to make an annual disclosure statement. So quite similar to current Australian legislation. There would be a number of mandatory criteria under that proposed legislation, including the identification of modern slavery risks, actions being taken to address those risks, and then both across businesses, operations and supply chains. However, to date, the coalition government has not commented on whether they will progress with drafting modern slavery legislation for New Zealand, and if so, whether that would be similar in nature to what was proposed by Labour or different. There's various campaigns you may have heard about currently for the government to adopt due diligence legislation. For example, there's open letters that have recently gone to the Workplace Relations and Safety Minister, who's responsible for modern slavery legislation, from a group of businesses and NGOs supporting due diligence legislation, as well as a letter from the investment sector spearheaded by Rachel Tinkler on this call. So nothing to date has been mentioned, but what we do know is that National has previously been supportive of modern slavery legislation. And they have actually publicly come out and said that Labor was taking too long to implement legislation. Prime Minister has stated that this modern slavery is an issue he would walk the streets for. So hopeful that there will be modern slavery legislation at some point. However, regardless of whether New Zealand does enact legislation or not, New Zealand businesses are increasingly needing to consider impacts of global legislation, investor pressure, reputation, relationship risks, and just the increasing focus of ESG due diligence as part of good practice. What we see at KPMG, many of our large clients that work in a global market are already reporting in other jurisdictions, and smaller businesses now are being increasingly asked about modern slavery risk processes and transparency across for their overseas clients. So we hear repeatedly from clients that they notice a rise in human rights focused audits, including on labour rights and worker wellbeing. So while I'd hope that due diligence modern slavery legislation will come into New Zealand, I don't think legislation alone will be the determinative factor as to whether businesses in New Zealand consider their modern slavery risks.
Thank you, Gemma. I think that would be a good time to put up our poll results with over 100 attendees on this webinar today, just whether people are involved in that space or not. So we've got about 46% of organisations that are on the call today, people that are on the call today that have started working on modern slavery. So that's quite interesting. And as far as roles, we've got about 18%, so roughly just over 18 people on this call who work in a sustainable investing or sustainability ESG specific role. So that's quite interesting. Thank you. So, Gemma, can you tell us what's happening globally in relation to modern slavery?
Absolutely. You may be aware in 2011, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were adopted by many countries. And while not mandatory, various jurisdictions since that time have regulated to make businesses more accountable for their human rights impacts, which includes modern slavery. Initial legislation tended to enact reporting requirements such as the UK and Canada and Australia. However, with growing recognition that reporting alone has been ineffective, essentially, there is an increasing shift towards mandatory due diligence legislation. Now, what I mean by mandatory due diligence is when we look at human rights due diligence, we focus on risks to people rather than traditional financial risks to a business. Mandatory due diligence requires businesses to proactively carry out due diligence, and that's to a higher standard than which is required under just reporting legislation. So globally, we're seeing the shift to due diligence with Germany, France, Norway, America, Switzerland enacting due diligence legislation. A number of other jurisdictions have drafted bills or issued government support for due diligence legislation. Some other jurisdictions, like Japan, have issued guidelines for mandatory due diligence as opposed to enacting legislation at this time. Probably the biggest shift is in the EU, so the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which I'll refer to from now on as the CSDD, has been approved by the EU Council. It will shortly reach its final hurdle of adoption for an adoption vote in the EU Parliament. Now, the CS3D will require certain EU businesses to undertake due diligence across their global supply chains, and we consider that will probably impact some New Zealand exporters and suppliers to the EU market. So closer to home, you may be aware that there's Australian legislation and both federal as well as New South Wales legislation. Many of our New Zealand companies report under the Australian legislation. Last year, the Australian government completed an independent review on the effectiveness of the Australian Modern Slavery Act. The review found that the reporting model of the Act had not resulted in meaningful change. There were too many businesses that were non-compliant for reporting, and many reporting entities were treating modern slavery as just a tick box compliance exercise. So while they might meet the criteria under the legislation, they weren't really taking the legislation to heart and what the purpose of it was, and really just doing the bare minimum to reach compliance. So the review report recommended 30 changes to the current legislation. Now, I won't go through all those changes, but those changes, the proposed changes, do include the introduction of mandatory due diligence, new mandatory reporting criteria, and penalties for non-compliance. So notably for New Zealand large companies that are not already reporting in Australia, a recommendation has been made to lower the reporting threshold from $100 million to $50 million. So there will be more businesses within New Zealand who will have to report in Australia.
Thank you, Gemma, and hopefully later on in the webinar we will have a bit more information about what this due diligence requires. So if I can turn now to you, Sam, can you recall when you first became involved or your role was involved with modern slavery?
Yeah, sure. So I first became aware of modern slavery within my role at Westpac about 3 years ago, when Westpac, along with over 100 New Zealand businesses, signed an open letter to government to ask for modern slavery legislation.
Okay. And if Westpac is supportive of this modern slavery legislation, why is that?
So I'd say that there were kind of 3 key points around our support for legislation. One of them is that modern slavery is unacceptable. It's about people being taken advantage of. So being a corporate, we get to play in society. So we see that we've got a moral obligation really to take action and do something. So for us, having legislation sets the minimum bar for what businesses should be doing. And also our experience in reporting under Australian legislation is that it's been really positive in that it's provided us a focus and framework to consider our modern slavery risks. It's also helped us prioritise attention on this issue. And what we found is that it's also provided transparency to stakeholders, and it really keeps us, it holds us to account to what we're doing, because when you're reporting on this year on year, you're wanting to improve and uplift in what you're doing. So that's been really positive. The legislation requires you to have a level of rigour, and it also requires an all-of-business approach. And probably the third thing is that, what Gemma's sort of touched on already is that, there are commercial benefits for, I'd say, NZ Inc. Even if we don't have legislation yet, being able to manage our modern slavery risks helps meet expectations of our global partners, whether investors, customers, suppliers. So it is around reducing our exposure to these risks. So all in all, it's a really positive thing.
Thank you, Sam. So the obligations are on Westpac Australia. How have you and your team approached modern slavery reporting under Australia law in New Zealand?
Yeah, so we've been reporting under the Australian laws because we're a subsidiary, and what we've been looking at is we've assessed our whole value chain as a business. So in financial services, our risk doesn't just sit in our supply chain or what we purchase, but it's right across our operations. So we've assessed that modern slavery risk pops up for us in 6 different areas, and Gemma did touch on that as well. So earlier, so we look at ourselves as a financial services provider. So looking at, are our products and services somehow facilitating modern slavery? We look at our role as a lender. So are we lending to customers that are connected to modern slavery? And we look at our role as an investor, as an employer, as a purchaser of goods and services, and also as a supporter of communities. So we're really needing to engage right across the bank and look deep, look at all our different processes, and And I think one thing I'd emphasise is that because modern slavery risk is so broad, it's not something that can be owned by one team or by sustainability. It cuts right across the business. So when I look at last year's reporting, I engaged with 16 different areas within the bank, and we had 6 different executive team members attesting to different parts of what was reported in.
Thank you, Simon. That's really wonderful to hear that all of this work is, being undertaken. Sarhanna, can I turn to you now? As an ASX-listed company, Tower is required to comply with Australian obligations. So can you tell us about your movement into this space and your experiences, and how did you get up to speed with the obligations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I joined Tower last year, and I had not actually previously been exposed to modern slavery legislation. Coming from a banking background, it was predominantly focused on things like CCCFA, financial advice, and so on. And then a couple of months into my role last year, I was handed a modern slavery statement and asked to update it. So I had a bit of a learning curve ahead of me. But really, I just took some practical steps. The first thing was familiarizing myself with the legislation. So actually going to read it, and then also doing a bit of reading around why it actually came into existence. The other thing I did once I kind of got to grips with that is do some wider reading on the social and humanitarian reason behind the legislation. And I actually found some UK resources particularly helpful towards my understanding of where we were going with it. From there, I moved it into a more Tower applicable situation. And I was fortunate enough to already have a statement that had been drawn up by my predecessor, but it was a matter of re-looking at it to ensure that what was in it was actually still accurate and fit for purpose. And so we had to re-look at the risks that had been identified and assessed to make sure that those were still what they were supposed to be. And to do that, as some set out, you can't do that in isolation. It's a cross-business effort because there are other people that are a lot more into details of how the business actually operates that you need to rely on to come up with the correct ending point, essentially, on those risks. So risk identification and assessment is just one aspect of it. I think from there, the meat and bones really becomes about making sure that you are appropriately managing those risks. Now, from a compliance perspective, there are some key questions that I like to ask, and it may be helpful to someone on the call for me to tell you what they are. It's a conversation that you have with compliance with other areas of the business to answer these key questions. So the first is, how will we deliver to the requirements that are set out in a legislative obligation? And so here I'm talking about processes, procedures, systems. What I don't want to see is compliance being a tick box exercise or something that happens as a side note to a day-to-day business process that's being carried out. It needs to be something that's embedded in the day-to-day operation. So where are our opportunities to do that? The second thing is what must go right with the delivery of those requirements. The third is how will we get it right every time? And so here I'm really talking about internal controls as an example. So what are our detective, corrective, or preventative measures that we can have in place? And then the last thing, which hopefully if you've got your procedures and so on set up and you've got really great internal controls, the last question is, what evidence we've got it right every time? And that should be an easy one to answer, assuming that all of the other steps have gone well. And so that was something, of course, that we considered, and is also an area of continuous improvement. The last thing that I'll point out with this particular question is that I became aware of how essential training and awareness across the organization is in relation to modern slavery. And that's because as somebody sitting in second line risk, or even somebody who's potentially sitting in procurement, they are not necessarily at the front line of seeing where this risk could exist for your company. It's people who, for example, could go out and visit a supplier in a frontline role that would be able to identify it. And so having them aware of the fact that modern slavery exists and how to identify it but then also giving them mechanisms to report it so that something can be done is super important. So, for example, having a whistleblower hotline set up or making it clear how to raise a risk incident would also be super important.
Thank you, Sarhanna. That's a lot of practical tips and advice, and I hope those who are on the webinar are taking notes. So what lessons or advice would you give someone in a similar position to you, someone who's just starting out or has had modern slavery added to their role?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think the first thing straight off the bat is, you don't need to know all the answers straight away. It's okay to give yourself some grace and to figure things out. As a person that may become a subject matter expert overnight, you need to actually help yourself get into that space. And then the other thing is that you're not actually alone in doing that. There are potentially people across your organization that may already have some knowledge and awareness of this space, but also a lot of resources online and externally in New Zealand that can help you. The other thing is that often you can already rely on technical skills that you have. So what I just outlined in my earlier answer is technical skills that I have from other pieces of legislation or other areas that I've worked on previously. And so whilst it's a new piece of legislation or a new concept, you've got it because you have that technical know-how behind you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sarhanna. That's really helpful. So turning now more to the investing space, Rachel, can you tell us when were you first exposed to modern slavery in your role?
Sure. So I've always had a personal interest in modern slavery, having first been involved in fundraising for sex trafficking and justice NGOs several years ago. So when we were thinking about our engagement priorities for the year ahead, one area we wanted to focus on in our thematic engagements this year was modern slavery. And this was sort of supported by all the happenings in the regulatory space around the legislation and things. So it made sense that should be a focus for us. And yeah, as Gemma mentioned, part of that is engagements with companies, but also part of it is engaging with policymakers. So mobilising investors to support a letter to the New Zealand government to outline our expectations on modern slavery legislation in New Zealand, and that we were all in support of it.
Thank you. And what are investors' expectations of companies managing their modern slavery risks?
Yeah, so much like we outlined in the investor letter, we hold the same expectations for companies. So which aligns with best practice international guidelines, which is that companies must conduct due diligence on their operations and their supply chain. So due diligence is about being proactive. As Gemma mentioned before, companies have to prove how they are working to mitigate exploitation. And if any exploitation is found, then the expectation is they have to remediate it. So that's another expectation of ours, is that if it is found, remediate it rather than just dropping that supplier. We're also, realistic in our expectations with companies that, and we apply like a materiality lens. So we expect a risk assessment to be carried out and then for action to be taken on the sort of highest risk areas, whether that be countries, sectors, or companies. So for example, if there's a business model that outsources recruitment or has high number of subcontractors, or as a franchise model, those are going to be higher risk versus a company that's importing 5 staff uniforms from China. So it's about focusing on the high risk areas, or what the OECD guidelines call severity. Alongside that is the concept of leverage as well. So again, this is from the OECD guidelines. So the level of influence you have over a supplier should also dictate where you focus your efforts. Where you don't have leverage, that's not necessarily an excuse to not take any action, but then you're thinking about how you can collaborate with other investors, with other companies in your industry that might have the same suppliers as you do. And then I think probably the underlying expectation is just get started. Have a discussion with your investors when they ask about it. Be honest about what the company perceives their highest risk areas to be, because we'll conduct our own internal risk assessment and produce, can share the results with you on what we perceive the highest risk areas to be, but that might not align. So just, have conversations and just get started.
Thank you, Rachel. So what is best practice for investment managers, and what tools can be used to identify these modern slavery risks?
Yeah, sure. So like Gemma has touched on, we consider internationally the best practice frameworks that are followed are the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. So the guiding principles are a framework that provides guidance on how to prevent and address human rights abuses in the context of business operations, and it emphasises the importance of due diligence within that. The OECD guidelines, and they also produce accompanying guidance. They make recommendations to guide the conduct of multinationals and serve as voluntary principles for responsible business conduct in the areas such as human rights, labour, and the environment. And the OECD guideline due diligence guidance is what outlines 6 steps of due diligence. So that's considered the best practice sort of frameworks to look at. And best practice from a risk assessment perspective, like I mentioned before, is that risks are assessed across countries, sectors, and companies. There's sort of an incorrect perception that as New Zealand is not identified as high risk, we don't have a problem here, but as Gemma's figures mentioned, that's just not true. And increasingly, the fact we don't have a modern slavery legislation is going to build up into more and more of a risk for businesses as the CSDDD comes into force, and potentially EU companies are going to choose to have a different company in Australia which does have legislation supply to them instead of a New Zealand supplier. So there are free tools out there to get started. The PRI has a list of resources. Walk Free has a toolkit. The Investor Alliance for Human Rights has a guide. So there's plenty out there to get started with, and none of those cost anything. There are groups out there that can supply analysis on your supply chains for a cost. Sometimes the risk with these, though, is that they're often self-reported. So a company can report that they've got no issues, even if that's not the case, or they haven't done the due diligence to discover those issues. And then the next, I guess, tier in the toolkit is to get assistance from someone like KPMG. And while this might cost a little bit more, it's a really comprehensive assessment and isn't relying on self-reported company data. So, but there's definitely, ways to get started without it being this huge, overwhelming responsibility.
Thank you, Rachel. Sarhanna, I'll turn back to you now. Rachel's just touched on investing and some on banking. How is insurance different when looking at suppliers?
So the key difference for an insurance company is probably the claim suppliers that we have on our books. And for Tower, for example, we have home, motor, contents suppliers that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And some of these suppliers are small, some of them are big. And sometimes customers want to choose their own supplier. And so we have to take into consideration all of those factors and what we're going to be doing and what is the best course of action to actually manage each of those different suppliers. The other area is cash settlement of claims. So sometimes a claim comes through, and instead of replacing something, the company decides that a cash settlement is most appropriate, and that is also an area where risk can arise. Because Tower is also across Fiji and the Pacific, along with New Zealand, we have considerations as well, such as facilities management, supplier staffing, in those jurisdictions that we consider too.
Okay, so we have a background. We have a bit more of an understanding now about insurance banking and investing. So I guess the next question is, now what? Turning to you, how can an organisation be proactive when evaluating companies?
So I guess I would start with firstly mapping out your areas of risk within your business and across your suppliers. And so Rachel spoke earlier to the different resources out there to help get you started. And then I think the next step is being clear what your position is and making sure that you're reflecting your position in your strategy or your policies. And then in terms of looking at how you're proactive around managing your risks, it's really back to due diligence. So looking at how you can embed due diligence into your existing processes. So it's not about needing to create a whole new process. It's about working with your current processes. So maybe having some extra checks in your sourcing processes, or checking that your credit risk policy and your assessments incorporate human rights and modern slavery risks. And then when you do have red flags, because this is seen as or classified as a higher risk area, then it's about having those conversations with your customers or your suppliers. So at Westpac, we've looked at which are our kind of higher risk categories or sectors. We've looked in our supply chain to see where are high risk categories. So, those are things like IT hardware or contractors, cleaning, security, uniforms, those kind of things. So it's I guess you could say it's looking within your business first, and then taking it from there.
Thank you, Sam. Gemma, can you elaborate any further on different types of modern slavery here and abroad and examples?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot in the media at the moment with different types of working visas for New Zealand. But for the financial services sector, I think we're looking at operations such as the security cleaning, those that Sam's already mentioned. So your actual operations, and then this supply chain further than that. New Zealand, there's recent reports from World Vision and the amount of risky goods that we bring into New Zealand. So this is a supply chain issue as well as just the local people issue. I think a starting point is to understand intersecting risk. So as Rachel's touched upon.
What's that, Gemma?
Sorry, have I gone?
No, can you tell us what that is?
Oh, sorry. Yes, so when we look at intersecting risk, and Rachel touched on this, when we look at modern slavery risk, we're considering various intersecting risk factors. So these include vulnerable populations, high-risk geographies, high-risk business models, so outsourcing labour, recruitment, not having direct oversight of your employees, and then high-risk products and service categories. So there's lots of information on where the high-risk sort of areas are, and can provide links to, there's some great resources. KPMG Australia has done some really great risks specifically for the financial services sector, which I'm happy to share, which, although Australian-based, are equally relevant to New Zealand. So businesses need to understand their own operations, but also beyond that, evaluating their supply chain. I do just want to pick up on what everyone else has already said, is that when we're thinking about risk and when we're talking about modern slavery due diligence, we have to take a practical business approach. There is going to be risk in all sorts of areas, such as all of the laptops, computers, and iPhones we might be on now. Obviously, we know that electronics is a high risk area. There's probably little we can do about that as a business, whereas we can consider how our e-waste has been utilised, and so that's a high risk area as well. So we might have controls and we might have influence over certain areas and not others, but also just focusing and being able to identify where your highest risk areas are means that you can work to address those risks in the first instance. And the companies that we've worked with in the FS sector, each entity will approach things differently depending on what their sort of supply chain are, and their appetite for risk are. But it might include things like the types of steps that Sam mentioned, but also things like in using your existing protocols and procedures. So, looking at evaluation of companies as part of global anti-money laundering programs, or know your client protocols. So just adding in some sort of extra questions or understanding around what businesses operate. One of the things we quite often see is where businesses are asking their suppliers where their business operations are, and your head office gets sort of put in as the detail, as opposed to where a good or service is manufactured or used from. So it's been understanding those nuances of where risks might apply. And it's also just having, as everyone else has already mentioned, the internal processes and understanding across multiple groups as to what modern slavery is and why and how it might play a part in different areas such as risk or legal procurement.
Thank you, Gemma. Sam, what have you seen as the biggest challenges and opportunities?
So I guess one of the biggest challenges is awareness of the issue, and because modern slavery is a hidden issue, and so at Westpac we've been working around providing some education. We had some training for our board as well. We had a day around ESG issues, so we included modern slavery in that, and just really talking more about the issue. And so I really think that the more we talk about it, the better it is, because it becomes less hidden. And I talk about it, in the professional context, but also in my personal context as well, because just people are really surprised when they kind of hear about what the issue is about. And the thing that I've been wanting to do more of is actually talk about the why, like focus on why the issue is an important one to get behind, as opposed to coming from a legislation is coming or this is a compliance exercise, because really this is about people. And once you really talk to people what the issue is, everyone actually feels really motivated and feel quite strongly about this issue and want to get behind it. So I think really the thing is, I guess the challenge is awareness, but it's something that we can actually do something about. At Westpac, we've also have a human rights working group, and we initially started focusing on modern slavery and then realised actually there's so much more in the human rights area, but this working group is pan-bank, so we've got people that come along and we focus on different things that we can work on, whether it's building capability or deciding that we want to deep dive into a certain area. And I think the other challenge is that also it is a really big issue, so it can feel quite overwhelming and quite confronting as well. But I think echoing what other panelists have said, it's about focusing on your material risks and just starting somewhere. And also as Sarhanna was talking about, we're all learning, we're all on a journey, we're operating in this imperfect market, but we can try and do something and also work together as well.
Thank you, Sam. You've made some really good points there, and that's why we are here today. Is we want to encourage education and get people on board on the journey as well. I'll throw that question out to the panel. Challenges, opportunities. Would anyone like to jump in and share there?
I'll just add quickly, Sam's covered it really well, and she on her LinkedIn shared a post earlier before this event, shared a post, a link sharing the webinar event and saying if no one really understands what I do in my role, come along to this webinar. And that is just so true, because there's this discussion of modern slavery and so many people are like, what are you talking about? So there's definitely a wider education piece that needs to go on. The only thing I'd add is that there's also we're not, from the investor's perspective, we're not expecting a company to just bowl on into a supplier and be accusatory and, say, we think you're doing all these things wrong. It needs to be more constructive with that. And there's even different sensitivities and different definitions across globally. I was on a call the other day with an ILO office in Asia, and they were explaining how child labour is defined differently across most of the Asian countries. So so it's not just about bowling in and being accusatory. It needs to be constructive.
I might just pick up on Rachel's point there, Chris, if that's right, that you might have not picked up when I was describing what we refer to modern slavery as, is where I said the worst forms of child labour. That is because there is no universal definition or age or anything within child labour. So it's having consideration of different countries and cultures is really important. And I will just pick up also that risk versus opportunities point. We talk about modern slavery risk. It's a lot of what I do is talk about modern slavery risk, but we need to start talking about modern slavery opportunities as well. And in particular has mentioned a lot of those. Like, it's just good business to understand. It's another risk to take consideration of. But when we're looking at ESG risk, we're talking about people. Modern slavery and broader human rights risks are really an opportunity for a business to be doing the right thing and to be doing it across their business as a whole. So it sets up really great frameworks for a whole lot of other opportunities as well.
Thank you. That is a really good point, Gemma. So, sorry, it was it's you, Sarhanna.
I was just going to add, just from a business perspective. I know sometimes sitting in a risk and compliance role, for example, you can kind of be the person that nobody really wants to hear from. And particularly in times like this where there isn't a New Zealand specific piece of legislation that the business has to comply with, or there will be some kind of consequence, for example, there could be a couple of people sitting on the call and kind of thinking, well, maybe down the line, this is something that we would want to deal with, but maybe it's not right now because we know how the business is going to respond to this. One of the things that I would encourage in that kind of situation, or even just for your consideration, is to talk to senior leaders within the organization who will actually get behind the why ahead of the legislation changes coming through, and get them across the line and understanding the rationale and the humanitarian reason behind actually managing modern slavery risk. And it's really that tone from the top that will help you actually achieve in the kind of vacuum we're sitting in, if this is something that you feel passionate about and that you actually want to go ahead and try and do something about.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarhanna. That's helpful for being in those roles. There is often the fear of being the unpopular compliance person. Gemma, what would you say if someone said to you they were concerned of the being perceived as this being anti-competitive behaviour and talking more openly? How would you address that?
There's definitely guidelines around what we can and can't do, but it's not... we're talking about humans here, right? So I don't think any business is going to, or any regulator is going to say we shouldn't be trying to find the best way to support humans. In Australia, there's a lot of industry groups that work together. Property Council, for example, have come together, their members have come together to create all sorts of tools and resources so that they don't have 50 suppliers going to or 50 clients going to the same suppliers asking the same questions. So there is discussions in the group, there is across different sectors, there is engagement. My advice is understand what the guidelines are, but do sort of encourage to be involved and ask questions of others. I mean, there's so many of us that talk regularly and informally and formally about these issues because we're all learning, and it's all something that matters. So yeah, there's lots of advice and tips and potential for collaboration in this space. I'll use the child sexual exploitation, which is a type of, sexual exploitation trafficking as a type of forced labour. There's a lot of collaboration in that space across law enforcement, NGOs, government sector, because that's the only way you're going to tackle this crime. The financial services sector, many on this call will be involved in, anti-money laundering and things in that sector, because that's the only way to work cross sectors is to tackle this crime. When we're working in consultancy within Australia, The banks, we were in a consultation group, and the banks were talking about how they all source their uniforms from the same supplier. So they looked at, possible ways to not all having to go and do the same audits with the same clients. So there's definitely different collaboration that does happen.
Cool. So we all know that today is just the beginning of engagement and conversations on this topic. So can we have the second poll up, please? Wonderful. So we would love to know if you being FSC members would like FSC meetings in this space. So can we please ask those who are members on the call to please respond to this last poll? Just while we're waiting on those results, on behalf of the FSC, I would like to thank you, Gemma, Rachel, Sam, and Sarhanna, for your time today. All of us sincerely hope that you learnt today what modern slavery is, and you have some tangible actions for your organisation. If you haven't taken notes on the questions Sarhanna brought up, the recording will soon be on YouTube. A lot of the helpful resources, tips and ideas, so you can go and listen again and follow up on some of them. Lastly, to wrap up, we would like to share some more exciting events that the FSC has got coming up. You will have no doubt heard about our conference, which is in September 3rd to the 5th of September this year. We've got on screen now a special access code to get special prices for our conference for those who are on the webinar today. So that's pretty exciting. Get in and come along, and I'll quietly let you know that there will be more material on modern slavery at our conference this year. We are also, our next FSC Connect webinar is on the future of total and permanent disability insurance. So jump onto the FSC events page to register for that. And we also have a lunch and learn coming up in May with Jane Wrightson from the Retirement Commission. So that's all we have for today. We hope that you learnt lots and keep on discussing and sharing, so this topic is becoming more known amongst our membership in our industry. Thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.